This is the polar sea ice. Its surface molded by winds and snow, its pattern of leads and ridges ever-changing with currents, winds, and tides. In the winter, there are 5 million square miles of it, covering an area twice the size of the United States. Over it, there is an ever-increasing air traffic network. If planes come down, it means a fight for survival. But men can land here and live, if they know how. This is Captain Jackson. A week ago, he and his crew were stranded on polar sea ice, 200 miles northwest of Isaacson Island, 600 miles from help. This is his report.
We took off on a resupply mission at 0700 hours with gasoline for 12 hours flight. At 0915 hours, we lost radio contact with our base. Our first sign of real trouble came when we lost control of the prop on #1 engine. Fire broke out. I got the ship down somehow, not the best landing, not the worst, but we got out with most of our survival equipment. Joe Martin, our civilian tech rep, was pretty badly shaken up with head cuts and shock. We gave him first aid right away. The situation looked bad. Our first job was to build some kind of a shelter. Ted Bannon of the RCAF, who knew the Arctic, suggested a spot in the lee of a pressure ridge. If the wind came up, we would be out of the worst of it. We made sure that the campsite was close enough to the aircraft, so if the wreckage was spotted from the air or picked up by radar, we would be seen. We were lost. As yet, no one knew we'd crashed. We could survive for a while if we went to work. We went to work. We had enough clothing for protection against the cold, but we sure needed all the equipment we had salvaged from the plane. I helped move the injured man, and the rest of the crew started moving the equipment to the new campsite. We were lucky to save as much as we did. We had supplies for about a week, if we were careful. If a storm came up, we might be here for days. If we panicked, we might be here forever. Even if the weather held clear, I knew no search would be started for 8 or 9 hours. We had lost the tents in the crash, but managed to salvage a 20-man life raft, which could be used as a shelter. The boys were beginning to feel the cold. Although they were not survival experts, they had taken survival training and wasted no time in getting the shelter started. The raft was inflated. To bring the floor down to the level of the snow, we clamped off the equalizer tube, then punctured the lower ring. While we were working, we kept the injured man inside the raft, making him as comfortable as possible. We anchored the life raft to keep it from shifting, and then put up the canopy. We'd saved 2 URC-4 radios for short-range contact, one Gibson Girl for long-range work. Airman Murphy, our radio man, lost no time breaking out the Gibson Girl. We had to get an SOS on the air. I told the men to wear goggles to prevent snow blindness and not to work up a sweat, because wet clothing could cause dangerous loss of body heat and possible frostbite. Meanwhile, Bannon showed the rest of the crew how to cut blocks from hard-packed snow. We'd use them in completing our life raft shelter. We built an L-shaped tunnel entrance to the shelter. It would help keep out the wind and be a place to store equipment. The wind was rising. For added insulation, we put a parachute over the shelter. It would be pulled tight over the blocks, then anchored with snow. Another parachute made a roof for the tunnel entrance. We pulled it tight and anchored it. We hoped our SOS was getting through. In lieu of a ground contact, the counterpoised ground wire was placed under and in line with the antenna. We transmitted across the 3-minute international silent periods when all radio operators monitor the distress frequencies. That lonely kite was our only hope of contact with the outside world.
They were now 4 hours overdue. Thule was alerted to stand by for search operations should they continue to be unreported by the time their fuel supply was estimated to be exhausted. From the flight plan, wind, weather, and the last position report, operations was establishing the search area. All available information about the missing flight was being compiled for transmission to all stations. The word went out. All rescue units stand by for possible search activities. Planes were made ready. Radio operators were alerted to listen for distress signals, and if heard, to get a bearing.
We had run into trouble. A sudden gust of wind had broken the kite. The Gibson Girl was useless until we found a way to get the antenna into the air again. But there were other things to be done if we were to survive. We needed drinking water. Lieutenant Jack Perkins, our co-pilot, filled the pressure stove out in the tunnel where there would be less danger of fire. He was careful to save any spilled fuel. Sergeant Lou Walker, our engineer, cut shavings from a block of clean packed snow to make our first supply of drinking water. A piece of metal under the stove kept it from tipping. To prevent burning the bottom of the pan, Sergeant Walker stuck his knife down through the center of the snow, stirring it until enough melted to cover the bottom. 2 of the crew went out to gather old sea ice, which would take less fuel to melt, provide more water, and be practically salt-free. It's generally found along the top of a pressure ridge and is easily identified by its crystalline structure and clear blue color. Back in camp, we'd melted enough snow for our first drink. We were to learn that it would take a lot of water to keep from becoming dehydrated in the dry Arctic cold. Water was especially important to our injured man, who was beginning to show definite signs of improvement. The shelter was fairly comfortable and dry. We tried to keep our cramped quarters as orderly as possible by assigning definite places to all items. We'd brought in enough rations for supper and breakfast. In the event we heard a plane, flares and signal mirrors were ready in the tunnel entrance. No one had to be told to keep a constant lookout for search planes.
Back in Thule, search crews were in final briefing. There were several possibilities. 1, the aircraft was down between its last reported position and destination, but still on course. 2, that it was down somewhere off course, and 3, that it had turned back after its last position report. The search would continue until every square mile of the search area had been covered visually and by radar.
The night was getting colder. I warned the men to watch each other for signs of frostbite. Never rub an affected area, but warm it gradually. Radio batteries and breakfast rations went inside our sleeping bags. Body heat would thaw out the rations, keep the batteries from freezing. Outer clothing went under the sleeping bags to keep out the cold. We had just settled down for the night when Bannon, who had drawn the first 2-hour watch, thought he heard an airplane. It was a false alarm. Before turning in, I told each man on watch to continue to listen carefully for aircraft, as well as possible cracking or separation of the ice in the camp area. The long night wore on. The watch heard nothing in the still Arctic night, only the occasional stir of the men. I didn't get much sleep that night. Worry kept me awake. It was getting colder and we still had a lot of work ahead of us. Breakfast such as we ate didn't raise our spirits much. The cold rations alone were bad enough, but cold rations eaten sparingly to conserve our limited supply really lowered morale. The coffee was weak, but anything warm felt good. I was beginning to be concerned about the crew's morale. The men had to be kept busy. I decided to inventory our equipment. Each man was asked to empty his pockets. Bannon, knowing the Arctic, was well prepared. He had a valuable assortment of small survival items sewn into his flying suit. These could save a man's life. I asked Joe Martin to keep a log of our activities. Lieutenant Perkins would be quartermaster in charge of supplies. In addition to the drop kits carried on the aircraft, we had individual bailout kits. Our rations plus the pemmican bars we carried in our clothing would last about a week if we were careful. But our fuel supply was dangerously low. Our guns would have to be stored outside to keep them from sweating and rusting. We knew we didn't have much chance of rescue unless we could get a signal on the air. Lacking another kite and unable to repair the damaged one, we decided to string the antenna of the Gibson Girl to the highest point on the pressure ridge and to mark the place with a piece of parachute cloth as a landmark for the camp. Bannon suggested we lose no time in building a snow house. He thought we could build an igloo big enough for the entire crew. He selected a place close enough to the ridge to provide some protection from the wind, but not so close as to be buried by the drifting snow. We'd need plenty of snow blocks. Generally on the polar sea ice, the hard-packed snow is shallow and blocks have to be cut horizontally. However, we found a spot nearby where they could be cut vertically and with less effort. We shaped and placed each block in a gradual ascending spiral. Our confidence increased as our work progressed. We had survived one night on the ice without serious discomfort. We knew we had a fighting chance.
The first cruise returned with a negative report. Radar had failed to show a downed plane. The crews saw neither lights nor flares to indicate survivors, but the search was just beginning. Other crews were briefed and assigned to search areas. The search was being pushed ahead at all possible speed, but the last weather report indicated a storm moving in.
We were keeping our fingers crossed on the weather, but if the storm did break, we now had a shelter almost completed. The key block was shaped and fitted to lock the other blocks in place to complete the ascending spiral of snow blocks which formed the walls and roof of the igloo. I packed snow between the blocks to make the igloo as weathertight as possible. We finished up inside by cutting a ventilation hole so we'd be safe from carbon monoxide. It was cut well down from the key block. If cut any higher, the warm air trapped in the dome would quickly enlarge the hole and let valuable heat escape. We put a signal tarpaulin on the floor as a ground cloth and brushed off the loose snow. A parachute provided several layers of additional insulation. Snow shoveled on the outside of the igloo would give us added warmth and protection from the wind. We then moved needed equipment out of the life raft into the igloo, brushing off the loose snow to keep the equipment and floor of the igloo dry. The raft shelter would now serve as a storage place. Later, we set up a signal marker. We made it by cutting a shallow trench, placing snow blocks along the edge to cast a shadow, and then spread sea marker dye along the top. Our Gibson Girl was now operating in the new watch station, a circular wall of snow with a snow pillar in the center supporting a parachute roof. We stayed on the air during the international silent periods for the rest of the day. The watch station was near enough to the igloo to be reached in any kind of weather. To complete the camp, we designated a latrine area to protect the health of the crew. We were all feeling pretty good that night. We didn't have the comforts of home, but we tried to make the best of things. I told the men that they were to stay inside as much as possible to conserve their strength. No one was to leave the camp area alone. Bannon had an idea I wanted the men to hear. He said he'd spotted a low-lying cloud indicating open water and possible game not far away. He suggested a hunting trip while we were still in good condition. Everyone volunteered to go, even the injured man. We knew that in an open lead there might be seals, or even a chance of finding fox or polar bear near the water. He selected Sergeant Walker to go with him. Next morning, the weather was good enough to go ahead as planned. Both men wore improvised backpacks. They took enough equipment for any emergency. A rifle for each, rations, a stove, candles, snow knives, sleeping bags, several lengths of shroud line, and in case they spotted a rescue plane, signal mirrors and flares. Lou also carried a pan for melting snow or ice, and a URC-4 radio, keeping the battery warm under his clothing to preserve its power. We synchronized watches. The hunters would make radio contact with the camp at noon. If they failed, they would try on the hour every hour until contact was made. a storm came up, they would wait it out before returning. We needed food and hoped they might find a seal. But even if they came back empty-handed, I knew that their experience would make a good topic of conversation to break the monotony of just waiting for rescue. At first, they made slow progress, stopping to set up a trail marker along their route every time it became difficult to see the last one. In the polar regions, a magnetic compass is not reliable, and the constant movement of the ice creates an even greater error in compass direction. The markers would be the only true guide back to camp. Each one was placed on the highest point visible from the last. Sea marker dye made them more visible at a distance. Often, in finding the easiest route through the rough ice, they had to change their direction, which they indicated by building an L-shaped marker. As Bannon started over a small ridge, he spotted. He'd shot a fox that had been feeding on a dead seal. The seal looked as though it had been worked over by a polar bear. A fox and a seal on the first day wasn't bad hunting. It meant an increase in the camp's food supply, and the seal's blubber would give us an additional supply of fuel. The hunters decided to skin the fox while it was still warm and drag what was left of the seal back to camp. But the sky looked bad. An Arctic storm was moving in. In almost no time, the wind was shrieking across the ice, driving curtains of snow. Travel was out of the question. Nearly noon, time to radio the base camp. Back in camp, I was getting worried. Our hunters couldn't travel in this weather. Ground drift had made visibility zero. But Sergeant Walker's voice came through strong and confident. They were building an emergency snow trench shelter in which they would wait out the storm. I told Walker we would be listening for his call tomorrow at 0800. They covered the entrance with a tarpaulin from one of their backpacks. The snow block was brought in to anchor the tarp from the inside and provide clean snow for a supply of water. There wasn't much room, but it would be easy to heat, and the men could keep warm in their sleeping bags. A piece of blubber from the seal, an empty ration can, and a piece of cotton made a blubber lamp. In a matter of minutes, the lamp warmed the shelter. Boiled fox, not quite like... Back in base camp, we were in a sober mood. The Gibson Girl antenna had snapped loose. There was no use keeping an outside watch. You couldn't possibly hear a plane, much less see it. There wasn't a chance we'd be found while the storm lasted. All we could do was what we were doing, hope and wait.
All search planes were grounded, but a Gibson Girl signal had been heard just before the storm closed in, and a bearing had been taken. The signal came from somewhere along the course the aircraft was to fly. A bearing from another station would pinpoint the spot. The signal meant there were one or more survivors. As soon as the weather cleared, the search would be resumed.
Throughout the day, the storm increased. I tried to keep the men busy. The strain and the uncertainty was beginning to tell. It wasn't until late afternoon of the following day that the wind began to die down. I had made radio contact with the hunters. They thought they could start back the next morning. By then, the storm had blown itself out. The trail markers weren't distinct, but they felt they could find their way back. To be sure, we arranged radio contact every 15 minutes. By using the directional properties of the URC-4, they could home on the camp radio. Our camp came to life with welcome activity. We dug out our signal marker and aired our sleeping bags to get rid of body moisture. Murphy, re-anchoring the antenna on the pressure ridge, saw the hunters first. They seemed in high spirits despite their adventure, and they'd brought back what was left of the seal. We decided on an immediate hot meal to celebrate the success of the hunters. Their experiences sure made good conversation. I've had better meals, but none that put more heart in me. It seemed to have the same effect on the others. Sergeant Walker volunteered for the watch. He said he'd had enough seal and blubber smoke. Then it happened. Walker heard it first. He was trying frantically to contact the plane. I told the men to save their flares till the plane came in sight. Murphy was grinding the Gibson Girl. And there it was, heading straight for us. We signaled with everything we had. It must have looked like the 4th of July. Sergeant Walker had them on the radio. We didn't need medical help, although a paramedic was on board ready to jump if we needed it. I think that plane was the prettiest sight I ever saw. Fuel, food, and fresh clothing were what we wanted most. They told us to stand by for the drop. The plane straightened out and came in over the camp. Our experiences sure made us appreciate what was in those drop kits. All kinds of food, fuel, clean dry clothing, cigarettes, and used sleeping bags. The pilot asked us to check a possible landing strip nearby and mark it with flags for a rescue ship to pick us up the next day. We were now pinpointed on the maps of every operating base in the Arctic. The next morning, they took us off the ice. We left some of our equipment and a little of our lives there. But we survived.
It was all in the report, the reasons why they came out safely. They worked and planned together as a team under competent leadership. They were resourceful. They never stopped trying to help the searchers locate them. They used their survival training. They didn't panic or give up. These are the reasons they survived.